The MacBook Neo is without a doubt the most hotly debated Apple product in years. On one side, you've got the defenders, suggesting that Apple is finally pushing into completely uncharted territory, that for the first time ever, they are courting the low-end consumer, a market currently dominated by Chromebooks and crappy little Windows laptops filled with bloatware. And then on the other side, well, you've got the detractors, suggesting that the specs of this thing are unjustifiable at any price, that it's just a machine with a mobile processor and a paltry 8 gigabytes of memory, that anybody who buys it is doing themselves a disservice, while anybody who recommends it is dishonest and doesn't have their audience's best interests in mind. Both sides do have some rationale, but I also think that both are coming at it from completely the wrong way. As with most things, I find myself somewhere in the middle on this. I do believe that the Neo is the most important computer Apple has released in years. In fact, I'd probably put it in the top 3 most important computers of the 21st century, alongside the unibody iMac and the M1 MacBook Air. Part of this is because it dispels the long-held, but now also incorrect presumption that Apple products carry an unjustified premium over the rest of the market. The Neo directly proves that belief wrong. It is in fact very modern Apple to release a machine at their lowest entry price, while the rest of the PC market has had pricing forced upwards by memory shortages. To be clear, this video is not going to do the "how does the MacBook Neo compare to Windows PCs at the same price" song and dance, because, well, that's already been done elsewhere, and also because I'm not one to hide my biases. The best part about any Mac is macOS. And despite my qualms with 26 Tahoe, it remains and will continue to remain the selling point for any Apple computer, regardless of price. So I will only compare the Neo to competition abstractly, because specs aren't the story that are worth telling here. What Apple actually has built is. And what Apple has actually built is a machine that is interesting precisely because of what it isn't. Flashy, premium priced, or covered in obvious text signaling, which is a philosophy today's sponsor shares in a completely different form factor. Meet the iNMO Go 3. Now, I will be upfront with you. AI glasses as a category has a bit of a credibility problem. Most of what I've tried has either been too chunky to wear in public without feeling like a goober, too limited to justify charging them every night, or some weird combination of both. So, when iNMO reached out, I went in skeptical, but what surprised me is how hard their new Go 3 leans into the least flashy thing a smart glasses company can possibly lean into, and that's just looking like regular glasses. At 58 grams with 8mm temples and a 5-axis CNC machined matte frame, these don't scream tech. They just read as perfectly normal-looking pairs of specs. There are 4 interchangeable frame styles depending on whether you're heading into a meeting or a coffee shop, and the display inside is a binocular green micro-LED waveguide that hits 1500 nits. So not incredibly flashy, but it matters, especially the brightness, because that's the threshold where you can actually see the display in daylight, not just in the dim booth at CES, something I definitely had a problem with other glasses we've tried on this channel. Now, as for what it does, the headlining feature is translation, with 78 supported languages, photo translation for signs and menus, and real-time dialogue translation when paired with their optional clip-on speaker accessory. For anyone who gives presentations, there is a teleprompter mode with AI-driven pacing that follows your speaking cadence. So if you improvise, or skip ahead, or you look around the room, or you go super fast, the script will keep up with you. I'm doing it right now. And for meetings, which is honestly where I've gotten the most mileage out of these, a 4-microphone array does voice print recognition to distinguish who's talking, it auto-records the whole thing, and then it generates structured minutes in the app afterwards. Battery is handled by a magnetic swap system. You pop one out, you click a fresh one in, it takes under 5 seconds, and the case itself holds 3 to 4 full charges. That's the solution that you ship when you've accepted that true all-day battery on a form factor this small isn't physically possible yet. It's an admission that I wish more companies in this space were willing to make. Is this the product that finally convinces me that AI glasses are here to stay? Well, they're certainly more useful than my Meta Ray-Bans. The iNMO Go 3 is launching mid-April via Kickstarter, and early backers get the glasses bundled with the Ring 4 and smart speaker for $499. The link is in the description if you want to take a look. Now, back to the Neo. The hardware here is a surprising departure from Apple's usual MO. In the past, the company has been willing to sacrifice repairability in the name of mass cost savings, cutting-edge performance, and remarkably thin design. And the Neo, it's not that. It is truly a computer built out of compromise, and no part of it matches the methodology that Apple takes on almost any of their other products. Its form factor is atypical. Despite being quite a bit smaller than the M5 MacBook Air and about the same thickness, it is equally as heavy. Now, you might suspect that's due to the battery, but no, the battery in the Neo is tiny because it's running an efficient iPhone chip. The weight largely comes down to the manufacturing process, which forfeits high-precision machining in favor of extruded aluminum that spends only a fraction of the time under machine tools. That cost-saving philosophy, it shows up elsewhere too, most notably in the trackpad, which is no longer force touch, no longer haptic. It's been a hallmark of every MacBook since the 2018 MacBook Air, which was finally the last model to ditch that mechanical click. That's absent on this machine. We're back to an analog click. But this is not created equal to most other clicking trackpads. The mechanism does feel slightly worse than the MacBook Airs, but I'd hardly call it bad. The tracking surface itself, like the glass, the capacitive multi-touch layer, is better than basically any other Windows laptop on the market, including the very excellent Microsoft Surface line, and it feels frankly identical to any recent MacBook. It's only distinguishable when you actually click. That's when you notice that it's lesser. And it isn't some like diving board design that you'll find on most other cheaper computers. Apple has done something very clever with a rigid backplate and a trackpad mounted button right in the middle, with little leaf springs helping to ensure a fairly consistent, even actuation force and spring back no matter where you press. It works well. Is it as good as the haptic trackpad? No. You know, the best equivalent I can think of is the iPhone 7, which moved to a haptic home button. At the time, everybody suspected that the change would be a downgrade, and in some ways it was, because the iPhone 7 didn't really feel like a clicking button. It just felt like a really, really good vibration, because that's what it was. It took a couple of weeks to get used to because you were in fact pressing something that didn't physically move, but once you got used to that motion, going back to an older iPhone felt legitimately horrible. Physical home buttons with their sloppy side-to-side actuation that would get grime and junk down inside and stick if you spilled anything on it, developing a scratchy feel over time. They felt archaic, they felt old, and the iPhone 7 fixed that. That's the way that the MacBook Neo's trackpad feels. It doesn't feel bad, it just feels kind of old. But so too does every other trackpad in the segment that the Neo operates in. In fact, those don't just feel old, they feel bad. This is a much better trackpad, it's just not flagship. The same cannot be said of the keyboard, which, as best I can tell, is effectively identical to the MacBook Air keyboard sans backlight. Now, on one hand, removing the backlight is a reasonable omission in the spirit of cost savings, but on the other hand, the target customer for the Neo is likely the demographic to most need a backlight to see the keys while touch typing. The display, with its chunkier bezels and missing notch, feels a little dated as well. And though many will say, well, I hate the notch, so this is an upgrade, I would like to interject the following. Aesthetics aside, you have to remember that the notch on the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, it's not really cutting into your 16:10 screen. Everything below the menu bar is 16:10. You're just getting a little extra screen real estate on top of that for the menu bar itself. The Neo does not have that, which means that the menu bar does cut into the aspect ratio of the display and subsequently makes said display a little wider. It's not preferred, in my opinion, to something like, the near-perfect 3x4 iPad, another device in this same price class, or even, as I mentioned, other MacBooks that the Neo finds itself priced underneath. But it is much better than the 16:9 displays found in most of the competition. So you gotta keep things in context. My single biggest complaint, and I know this is going to sound funny, is a simple hardware omission. The lack of an ambient light sensor. It's quite frustrating to open the laptop at night and be blinded, or to open it up in the afternoon and have it be so dim as to be illegible. I have hit the brightness keys on this keyboard more than I have ever touched the brightness keys on any recent MacBook Air or Pro. And yet, just like with the lack of a backlit keyboard, you do kind of get used to it. It doesn't feel crappy, it just feels old. And I guess here's the strange irony underneath all of this. Apple had to actively engineer most of these compromises into existence. This trackpad mechanism, it's not some carryover part from an old 2015 MacBook Pro. It is a new design built specifically for this machine. The Neo doesn't feel old because it's old. It feels old because Apple's own standards have raised the bar so high that even cutting back requires innovation, which, when you sit and kind of think about it, is a little bit of a flex. But importantly, the things that Apple chose not to compromise on, the build quality, the display quality, the battery life, are exactly the things that they should not have compromised on, and they are the compromises made in other cheap laptops. They made all the right choices here, but there is no denying that they have had to make cuts. Now, while we're talking about departures from Apple's usual playbook, Repairability here is genuinely worth celebrating. Many other laptops in this price range are glued together with very poor parts availability, essentially e-waste if something breaks. But the Neo is not just the most repairable Mac in years, it is likely one of the most repairable laptops at this price point, period, maybe at any price point. Every single aspect of this device can be removed and disassembled other than the aluminum top lid from the display itself. But given that you only have an inexpensive USB webcam and a microphone inside here, I don't think it's that terrible. You can buy just about any part for this machine as a consumer through the self-service repair store, and the pricing is pretty reasonable, at least relative to what Apple charges for their other machines' parts. The battery at $134 for a 35 watt-hour pack is, in my opinion, a bit egregious, but the bottom case lid is only $35. Not bad. The keyboard assembly is only $140, and it no longer requires replacing the entire bottom half of the computer like every other MacBook in Apple's lineup. And even better, for the first time in many, many years from Apple, I can't even remember, since before the butterfly keyboard, so like 2015, we are seeing per component repair down to individual keys. Not just the keycaps themselves, but the switch assemblies as well. Awesome. The most expensive part, outside of the logic board itself, is the display at $308, because again, it includes the aluminum and the camera and everything else. And that's pretty steep, especially considering that most educational institutions will be buying this device at around $500 to begin with. However, if you send the old display back to Apple for recycling, the price drops down to $220. Still not ideal if broken, about half the cost of the machine, but hardly the extortionary multi-hundred, near $1,000 repair where you'd be better off replacing the entire machine with a newer model, as is true with other Macs. And it is worth noting, by the way, that pricing for educational institutions and enterprise replacement programs that buy in massive volume is almost certainly lower per unit of cost and per repair part than the consumer self-service tier that we would be paying. For the target buyer, repair is more accessible than the sticker prices would suggest, and I think that's great. Of course, being a Mac, this thing runs macOS, full and unadulterated, something that even Apple's much more powerful and more expensive iPad Pro, which I love, cannot do. And the Neo? It honestly runs macOS pretty well. I will say, however, that I did experience more device slowdowns than I can remember in recent years, especially during the machine's initial configuration. You know, while File Vault is encrypting the drive, and while apps are installing from the App Store, while Photos is syncing from the cloud, this multi-day setup process did feel slow at times, and a few instances, the machine beach balled, kind of just doing nothing. And it wasn't just on this unit. I got my wife a pink Neo to replace her aging M1 MacBook Air, and hers was similarly slow. Were these slowdowns game-breaking? No. Were they permanent? No. After a few days, performance settled to about where I'd expect, but they happened. And this is the first time in the Apple Silicon era where I've used a Mac and thought, yeah, this is kind of slow, isn't it? It doesn't feel bad. It just feels a little old. What the Neo absolutely does feel competent at is real work, because unlike a Chromebook, which mostly requires everything run in the web, and I know that's not strictly true anymore, but effectively it is, the Neo runs any macOS app natively, because it's a Mac. I run Photoshop on this. I've edited video on this. I have done Xcode compiles and builds on this. It's actually pretty fast. Installing Xcode takes forever, but that's true on every Mac. Is it indistinguishable from my MacBook Air in the same way that an A16 iPad is indistinguishable from an M3 iPad Air? No, you can absolutely tell the difference. But the Neo isn't bad, it's just a little bit worse. And a little bit worse at half the price is to be expected. It feels just a little bit old, which brings us to the elephant in the room. 8 gigabytes of memory. I was criticized by another YouTuber for dismissing the reality that 8 gigabytes was okay in a MacBook, because just 2 years ago, I praised Apple for finally dropping the 8 gig spec, claiming it was no longer enough in the year 2024. Well, that was 2 years ago. I think that YouTuber was being a bit disingenuous to suggest my statement was a universal blanket, because 2 years ago, Apple was not selling a MacBook Neo for $600, and while yes, you could argue that the Mac Mini is also $600, the Neo includes a bunch of things that the Mac Mini doesn't. A display, a keyboard, a trackpad, a battery. The silicon cost difference between an A18 Pro and an M4 is smaller than you would imagine, making the Mac Mini a much higher margin product than this one. And it also makes it such that they can justify a higher starting memory count, especially in the world of current RAM pricing. But again, I'm not saying that 8 gigabytes isn't ideal. It's not great, but 8 gigs is not Apple being a dick on purpose. It is just the reality of using this chip, because it comes with 8 gigabytes of memory on package during fabrication, and we'll come back to why that matters shortly. But on to performance, for most normal workflows today, 8 gigs is still fine. The question is whether it continues to be fine 3 or 4 years from now. That's where things will get interesting. I had one Xcode build from scratch that put enough memory pressure on the Neo that it hung hard. It didn't just beach ball. The cursor stopped responding entirely. It didn't crash. It rebounded eventually because swap on macOS is very, very good, but it did stall. And it got me thinking, swap is only effective when there is disk space available. A lot of disk space ideally. And at 256 gigs on this base configuration, well, that doesn't leave very much available to the system after the user throws all their crap on it, especially iCloud photos. And where MacBook Pro or Air owners are either not sophisticated enough as users to ever use more than is available in their DRAM and swap cache, or are sophisticated enough to identify why their computer has slowed down and take proper action, the same is not true of the Neo's target buyer. There will be Neo owners a year from now who are confused why their machines have become so slow. It's not the silicon, it's not really the RAM, it's not even really the disk performance, is that there is nowhere to shove all of that swap when no free space exists on the drive, which is going to happen because heaven knows they can't even keep everything in DRAM when half the DRAM allocation is being used just to run macOS. And so this naturally brings us into our other longevity question, long-term software support. This year marks the end of Intel support. macOS 27 will not support Intel Macs, which puts the newest unsupported Intel Mac at 6 years old. 6 years from today puts us in 2032. Do we presume that the Neo will be supported in 2032? Spec for spec, it has worse system performance than a nearly 6-year-old M1 MacBook Air. Now, having said that, and I think a lot of reviewers forget this, even though the A18 is less performant than an M1 in a lot of ways, maybe even most ways, it is a much more modern chip that shares far more architecture with modern M-series silicon. Therefore, it will be way easier for Apple to continue to support this machine into the future. But while I have no doubt that the Neo will be supported longer than the M1 Air and Pro, not because Apple can't keep supporting those older 8 gig machines, but because supporting rapidly diminishing number of M1 owners is not cost effective, it does bring up the question, well, how long will Apple support this? And how long will they support Apple Silicon devices? Will they support these machines longer than they did with Intel computers? Perhaps. iOS 26 still supports the iPhone 11, a device from 2019. But if Apple phases out Apple Silicon devices with the same cadence as they have on Intel machines, that means that next year, well, the first M1s are getting the boot. And that also means that in just 3 years, they won't have to support any machine that shipped with 8 gigabytes of memory, other than this. And are we to suspect that Apple will hold macOS back to support this one weird low-end device? I think probably not, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's yet another thing that makes this the cheaper machine. Lesser long-term support and feature updates down the road, maybe only 3 years or 4 years instead of 6. Hey, Future Quinn here. Look, these videos take a few weeks to make, and I had surgery, but it all kind of panned out because I had this whole section in my video about how the Neo's A18 Pro is leftover silicon from the iPhone 16 Pro. Bin chips with a dead core here or a flaw there that made them ineligible to be used in the iPhone, but that they could use in something lower end like this instead of just throwing away. I also talked about how Apple was going to run out of these leftover chips way faster than they or anybody else expected because of the success of the Neo. I mean, Cook himself said as much on the recent earnings call. My prediction was that Apple would just refresh the MacBook Neo early with the A19 Pro and its subsequent 12 gigabytes of packaged memory, thereby solving the MacBook Neo's biggest problem, the memory. Because, I mean, reopening a fabrication line to make the A18 Pro would be financially insane. But it turns out that I'm dumb, because that is exactly what is reported to be happening. TSMC is said to be spinning A18 Pro production back up, which makes the per-cost chip of the silicon in these new MacBook Neos, if they do that, meaningfully higher, because they're not leftovers, they're not available for free, they're not the consequence of fabricating higher-end chips. No, they're spooling them back up to make this machine on purpose. Yet, it is still reportedly offsetting the cost increases of using the A19 Pro because of the stupid freaking DRAM pricing that is going on right now. Reviving an old chip line is cheaper than 4 gigabytes of memory per unit, which is just wild, the times that we are living in. Now, many assume that if and when this happens, not if, it will happen, when this happens, that Apple will pass their increased costs on to customers by either discontinuing the low-end model or by hiking prices. But I really don't think Apple will do this because I don't think they can. The Neo is dominating in its segment because of price, and surrendering that advantage to protect margin would forfeit this entire strategy. Cracking the low end of the market is just the cost of doing business. If they want this beachhead, and I wager that they do, they're willing to pay for it, which also means that the recommendation I now give is a little bit different than what I had planned. Past Quinn would have said, well, just hold off on the Neo because a refreshed 12 gig model is right around the corner, probably before year's end. It's all but inevitable. Well, but now I don't think that's happening. And the gap in between an 8 gigabyte and a 12 gigabyte machine that you intend to keep for many years is significant. Now that that bet's off the table, it seems that the Neo that you can buy today is the Neo that you'll be able to buy the foreseeable future. So either pull the trigger and suck it up, or, as my recommendation has always gone, find a used MacBook Air or MacBook Pro with more memory, a better chip, faster disk, and frankly, longer-term support for similar amounts of money. Having said all that, this is a very important computer, and people who buy one will like it. I mean, buyers cross-shopping between this and an entry-level piece of Garbo Windows laptop, they are far better served here. Buyers cross-shopping between this and an iPad will likely find themselves more satisfied with this machine. And casual Mac owners, like my wife, will find this a completely suitable modern replacement to the M1. I know that sounds surprising to hear, but it's reality. And if you're not a nerd and you don't get it, let me explain. I gave this machine, well, the pink one, to Megan, my wife, and her reaction was, wow, this is a lot nicer than my old computer. Despite the fact that it's basically the same machine in performance while having lesser build quality and fewer features. It didn't matter. She didn't care, and most people won't. Get this through your head, you nerds. The Mac has slowly been gaining market share since the transition to Apple Silicon, and I think the Neo is about ready to rapidly accelerate that. It is crazy to see this machine, one that despite being compromised basically in every way, really did have a lot of care and thought put into it. And that's coming from a company that just 6 or 7 years ago had us Mac fans wondering if the Mac would even survive, if it was dead. We were in hell. The MacBook Pros with the stupid touch bars being thermally throttled. There was the absence of a real pro Mac, and the iPad was stealing the limelight from the Mac at every opportunity. The turnaround from there to here is remarkable. And the Neo also has me wondering what's in store for Apple's other devices. I mean, the MacBook Pro is slated to get a touch screen later this year, along with an OLED display. And unlike many other people, I don't actually believe there will be a fundamental redesign of macOS to accommodate touch, because I think Apple still believes what Steve Jobs said all those years ago, that having to reach your arm up to touch your Mac screen is less than ideal. They'll accommodate touch, but I don't think they're going to encourage it. And in a world where non-touch Macs and touch Macs have to coexist in the same lineup, no changes to the OS can be so fundamental as to change what the Mac even is before every device supports the new input paradigm. So I suspect a slightly dynamic UX change, tap targets that grow when you touch the screen, gestures like swiping down to access Control Center will be supported, but I'm skeptical that we'll see any massive change that forces or frankly even compels you to use touch at all. So then why add it? Well, as a full-time iPad user, I often accidentally reach up to touch my MacBook Pro's display, only afterwards realizing, dum-dum, this is not an allowable input method. It's never my primary interaction. It's not even really an ideal one, but the thing is, I can touch it. If you want to touch the screen or touch the trackpad, both should be accepted. The irony is that while Apple has to start somewhere, it does seem a bit funny that they're offering touchscreens to the demographic least likely to want them. The MacBook Pro user base, plugged into external monitors and studio displays, running pro apps and development workflows, they don't give a crap. Whereas the MacBook Neo user, coming from an iPad or a cheap Windows laptop that almost certainly has a touchscreen, they're the ones likely to reach up and touch the display. And yet this user, will not be getting a touchscreen for many years to come. Running macOS on a phone chip also begs the question, well then, if this can run macOS, why can't an iPad? And my answer is that, well, Apple just doesn't care about you. They don't care about me. They don't want it to. Apple doesn't view silicon anymore the way that us consumers for some reason still do. It's not about whether something has an A-series chip or an M-series chip. It doesn't matter to Apple. It's just Apple silicon. How many can we manufacture? How good are the yields? What does the binning look like? Using a phone chip, one made in the millions every year, makes a lot of sense for your budget laptop, which you're also trying to sell in the millions. If anything is to happen to the iPad over the next few years, Shut up, Alexa. If anything is to happen to the iPad at all over the next few years, the only thing I can foresee happening is allowing you to run macOS binaries and selected binaries within iPadOS, almost like Parallels lets you run Windows apps inside the macOS desktop without the Windows desktop environment. But the notion that iPadOS is going to become macOS, or they're going to merge, or the iPad will run macOS, it seems futile as either an app or a dual boot device or otherwise, because ultimately that would make the iPad a worse iPad, which Apple is not going to do. If you yearn for something like that, your heart will only be broken, man. So just, I don't know, get a MacBook Pro with the touchscreen. That's probably as good as it's gonna get. What is this video about again? Oh, yeah. The Neo really does stand as the best example of a completely refined, well thought out product. Most importantly, this is the perfect gateway into the Apple ecosystem. So much of America owns and loves the iPhone, but a surprisingly small percentage of those people also own and love the Mac. This could be the device that changes that. This could be the thing that pushes the Mac to heights never before achieved. And while it wouldn't be my first recommendation, it's certainly not a bad device. If this is the budget you're shopping in and you can't afford more, well, buddy, get this thing and start smiling, because it's a Mac. And Macs are great. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay snazzy.